Hello, my friends. Let's continue because what's unfolding around Geneva is bigger than a single meeting or a single document. What you're watching is the collision between battlefield reality and political fantasy. And Geneva is just the stage where that collision becomes visible to the whole world. The Europeans arrive angry because they know time is against them. They can talk about leverage, frozen assets, EU integration, NATO processes, and all of that sounds impressive in a press conference. But none of it changes the basic truth that Russia sets the tempo of this war. If Moscow says no, the war continues on Moscow's terms. If Moscow says yes, it's because Russia believes the deal locks in strategic gains. That's the asymmetry nobody in Brussels wants to admit out loud. And here's the deeper problem for Europe. Even if they did get all four amendments they want, even if they force Trump to rewrite the language, even if they got the magic phrase about territorial integrity pasted in bold letters, Russia still won't sign anything that contradicts its core objectives. Those objectives are not vague anymore. Neutral Ukraine, no NATO pathway, recognition of the territorial outcome, and a government in Kyiv that cannot be weaponized against Russia again. That's it. Everything else is negotiable window dressing. So when Europeans keep acting like they can renegotiate the fundamentals, what they're really doing is buying time for a war they can't win and don't want to fight themselves. Now, why do they want that time? Because Europe does not have a peace strategy. It has a stall strategy. A ceasefire lets them reload, rebuild Ukraine's forces, and try again later. That's why they obsess over army size and security guarantees. They're not thinking about stability. They're thinking about a reset button. The Russians know this. Putin has said this in different ways for 2 years. A Minsk-style freeze is a trap. So the Europeans can demand a ceasefire all day long, but Russia will not accept a pause that simply recreates the same threat under a different label. And I want you to notice something else. The Europeans talk like Ukraine is a sovereign actor deciding its own fate. In reality, Ukraine is a battlefield instrument of larger powers, and its leadership is now caught in a legitimacy spiral. That's why the elections clause matters so much. Kellogg didn't invent that. He's admitting out loud what everyone already knows. You can't sign a historic settlement with a government whose mandate is expired, whose popularity has collapsed, and whose institutions are rotting under wartime corruption. From the Russian side, elections aren't a detail. They're the firewall against a repeat of the same Western playbook. Now, let's be very clear here. If elections happen, the political map inside Ukraine changes. It has to. The public exhaustion is too deep, the casualties too high, the economic devastation too obvious. The idea that Ukrainians will vote to continue this war indefinitely for the sake of European ambitions is delusional. If you let people vote, they vote for survival. They vote for an end. They vote for rebuilding. That terrifies the European leadership because once Ukraine's political class shifts toward realism, Europe loses the instrument it has used to posture against Russia. Meanwhile, in the background of Geneva, the front line keeps moving. That is the real clock on these talks. Every week Russia advances, the negotiating space shrinks for Kyiv and Brussels. That's why the U.S. is forcing the issue now. Washington doesn't want to own the final collapse. Trump wants to say, I offered a deal, I tried, they refused, and then he wants out. Whether he fully follows through is another question, but that's the logic behind the pressure. Driscoll wasn't being dramatic when he told European envoys they have no cards. He was describing the battlefield in plain English, and Europe's response to that plain English was rage, not because they don't know it's true, but because hearing it from Washington is humiliating. The Europeans were dragged into this project under the promise that Russia could be broken, its economy strangled, its army exhausted, and its leadership destabilized. None of that happened. In fact, the opposite happened. Russia adapted, Russia expanded production, Russia stabilized its economy under sanctions. Russia built deeper non-Western trade channels. And militarily, it has outlasted and outperformed the NATO proxy model. That is why Geneva feels like a funeral for European credibility. The frozen assets issue is another layer of the same humiliation. Europe is clinging to those 300 euros, billion like a drowning man clings to driftwood, not because it changes Russia's war aims today, but because Europe needs it to finance the illusion tomorrow. Without that money, the European project in Ukraine collapses. But here's the trap. The more Europe treats frozen Russian assets as its own purse, the more it guarantees a future reckoning with Moscow. Russia may not be making battlefield decisions based on that money right now, but I promise you it will not forget. Russia has legal, financial, and asymmetric tools. It has its own leverage in Western assets, markets, and long-term relationships with the global South. Confiscation is not a free lunch. It's a time-delayed explosion. Now step back and look at the bigger structure. Geneva is a Western argument with the Russians not even in the room. That alone tells you the problem. You can't negotiate peace by negotiating among yourselves. You can't rewrite reality with communiques. The Russians don't have to attend Geneva to win Geneva. They win it through facts on the ground. And that's why the Europeans are reduced to theatrics, declarations, moral framing, security of all of us, and endless talk of creating a European NATO. It's posturing born from weakness. And what happens if they keep posturing? The war drags on, Ukraine bleeds out, Europe destabilizes internally, and Russia takes what it believes it must take to secure its border permanently. That's where this road leads. Europe thinks refusing a deal creates leverage. In reality, refusing a deal accelerates an outcome they fear most, a decisive Russian military settlement with no Western input at all. The irony is brutal. The more Europe tries to keep a seat at the table, the more it risks being locked out of the final settlement entirely. So, as we wait for headlines out of Geneva, don't get distracted by the noise. Watch the structure. Watch the incentives. Watch who is acting from strength and who is acting from panic. Russia is negotiating because it can afford to. Europe is negotiating because it can't survive the alternative. The US is negotiating because it wants to offload the disaster. And Ukraine's leadership is negotiating because its legitimacy is collapsing under the weight of a war that has already slipped beyond its control. We'll see tomorrow how they spin it. And there will be spin, believe me. There will be statements about unity, values, and progress. But underneath that, the math doesn't change. Peace only happens when the side losing accepts the terms that stop the bleeding and the side winning accepts the terms that guarantee its security. That is the basic rule of war. Geneva doesn't repeal that rule. And let me take this one step further, because if you stop the analysis that this is a game changer, you miss the deeper logic of why it's a game changer and what comes next. The real shift here isn't merely a Western proposal that acknowledges Russia's gains. The real shift is psychological and institutional. The taboo in Washington against treating Russia as a strategic equal has cracked. Once that taboo cracks, it doesn't just affect Ukraine. It reshapes the whole European security architecture, the sanctions regime, the energy map, and even the internal politics of the West. Think about what had to happen for a U.S. president, any U.S. president, to put a plan on the table that implicitly validates Russia's red lines. For 3 years, the West told itself a story that Russia is isolated, that Russia is weakening, that time was on the West side, and that if they just poured more weapons and money into Ukraine, the battlefield would eventually bend to their will. But the battlefield didn't bend. Reality did. And Trump, whatever you think of his personality or his chaos, is someone who reacts to reality faster than the bureaucracies around him. The Pentagon, the intel community, the European chancelleries, they are still locked into the narrative of 2022. Trump is operating in 2025. That's the difference. And this is where Europe's panic becomes the most revealing part of the whole story. Because for Europe, the Ukraine war was never only about Ukraine. It was about preserving a US-led order where Europe could outsource its security thinking to Washington while simultaneously pretending to be a moral crusader. Ukraine was the banner. Russia was the adversary. The bigger objective was to keep the Atlantic system intact. So when Trump proposes something that moves the conflict toward a settlement on Russian terms, Europe reads that not as diplomacy, but as betrayal. They see their entire post-Cold War identity collapsing right in front of them. That's why their language is so emotional and so irrational. It's not strategy, it's grief. Now, I'm not saying Trump is some grand philosopher of multipolarity. He isn't. He's transactional. He wants to stop bleeding resources for an unwinnable proxy war, and he wants to reset the U.S. position so that America isn't trapped in Europe's decline. He also wants to open economic lanes with Russia because he instinctively understands something that Europe refuses to accept. Russia's not going away. Russia's not collapsing. And Russia is a permanent pillar of Eurasian power. You can either deal with that like adults or you can keep living in fantasy. Trump chooses the adult path not because he's virtuous, but because he's pragmatic. And from Russia's side, that pragmatism is exactly what they've been waiting to force out of the West. Russia didn't walk into this war to take land in some cartoonish imperial sense, the way Western media frames it. Russia walked into this war to end a geopolitical threat that had been growing on its border for 30 years. NATO's military creep, intelligence penetration, and the transformation of Ukraine into an anti-Russia fortress. If you take that threat away, Russia can stop. If you don't, Russia will finish the job militarily. That's not a threat. That's the logic of national survival. Every great power behaves that way. The West just pretended Russia wouldn't. So when Trump's plan says no NATO, reduce Ukrainian forces, and effectively recognizes the territorial outcome, it is not giving Russia a gift. It is acknowledging the reality that Russia created through endurance, force, and strategic patience. This is what winning looks like in geopolitics. Your opponent starts speaking your language. That doesn't mean Moscow trusts Washington. It doesn't mean Russia expects perfection, but it does mean the diplomatic terrain is shifted in Russia's direction. Now, here's the part that most people still don't want to say, but it's important. Once the West starts moving toward recognition of Russian security interests, the entire moral scaffolding of this war collapses. Because the moral scaffolding depended on denying that Russia had legitimate concerns. It depended on pretending the war was unprovoked, irrational, and purely about conquest. The moment a Western president says, okay, Ukraine can't be in NATO and must be neutral, he is implicitly admitting that Russia's core complaint was real. That admission is historic. It doesn't just change policy, it rewrites the story. And once the story changes, public support changes with it. That's why the Europeans are desperate to stop this before it becomes normalized. They know that if a US-Russia settlement framework becomes the new baseline, Europe is left holding the bag, economically devastated by sanctions, politically fractured by migration and austerity, and strategically irrelevant in the architecture of a post-unipolar world. Europe tried to be the conscience of the West. Now it risks becoming the relic of the West. And watch what happens next if this direction continues. First, you'll see more open contact between Washington and Moscow at senior levels. Second, you'll see a quiet loosening of certain sanctions tied to energy, finance, and industrial trade. Third, you'll see growing pressure on Kyiv to accept elections because legitimacy is the key that allows any post-war order to hold. Fourth, you'll see European governments becoming even more shrill because shrillness is what decline sounds like. But the main thing is this. Even if this specific 28-point plan gets stalled, diluted, or even temporarily derailed, the direction has already changed. You can't unsee reality. You can't put the cat back in the bag. The West has crossed a psychological threshold. It has begun to talk about ending this war in a way that accepts Russia's leverage rather than pretending it doesn't exist. That alone guarantees that the future proposals, whether from Trump or whoever follows, will be more realistic than anything we heard in 2022, 2023, or most of 2024. So yes, there is reason to be cautiously optimistic, not because peace is automatic, but because realism has re-entered the room. And realism is always the first brick in a real settlement. If Europe wants to keep living in slogans, it will be sidelined. If Kyiv wants to keep living off fantasies of infinite Western support, it will be forced to change. And Russia, which has already paid a massive price to secure its strategic future, will not surrender that future at the negotiating table after winning it on the battlefield. That's where we are. This is not the end of the story. It's the moment the story finally turns toward truth. And from here on, every player who refuses to adapt to truth will be pushed aside by history, no matter how loud they shout, no matter how many press conferences they hold, and no matter how many moral speeches they give. All right, my friends, that's my continuation for now. We'll see how the next 48 hours shape the messaging out of Geneva and the reactions in Kiev, Brussels, and Moscow. But keep your eyes on the structure, not the noise. The structure is shifting, and it's shifting in Russia's favor. The contemporary global landscape presents unprecedented challenges for the United States across multiple theaters of international conflict and competition, ranging from ideological confrontations in the Western Hemisphere to proxy warfare against a resurgent Russia and the rise of China as a genuine peer competitor in East Asia. Understanding how these pressures interact requires examining the deeper logic of great power politics and how military intervention often fails to translate battlefield power into political outcomes. Venezuela illustrates this dynamic clearly. For more than a century, Washington has opposed left-leaning governments in Latin America, whether genuinely communist or merely socialist, sustaining a pattern visible in interventions like Chile in 1973 and Guatemala in 1954. Venezuela under Hugo Chavez and Nicolas Maduro is only the latest expression of an ideology deemed incompatible with U.S. preferences for hemispheric dominance, a worldview in which no state in the region should challenge American interests. Claims that Venezuela poses a direct security threat strain credibility. The narco-terrorism narrative is weak, and Caracas has no military capacity capable of threatening the U.S. The only scenario that would resemble historic precedents, such as the Cuban Missile Crisis, would involve Venezuela forming deep military alliances with Russia or China, which is not happening, although the U.S. can deploy powerful naval and air assets capable of striking Venezuelan territory. Military theory demonstrates that airstrikes can destroy but cannot impose political outcomes without ground forces. Venezuela is far larger and more complex than Grenada or Panama, and any attempt at regime change would require tens of thousands of troops with no easy exit and no clear path to stabilizing the political chaos that would follow. Removing Maduro would not resolve the structural issues inside Venezuela, and expecting a quick transition to democratic prosperity overlooks the reality that military institutions excel at destruction, not nation building. Historical experience from Vietnam to more recent interventions shows that armies are ill-suited for reconstructing foreign societies. Recent patterns confirm this limitation. The administration withdrew after a month of inconclusive action against the Houthis in the Red Sea and launched only a one-day strike against Iran without follow-up. Such outcomes suggest the limits of American military adventurism, making large-scale operations in Venezuela highly unlikely, with only symbolic airstrikes offering little political value and ultimately pushing Washington toward negotiated settlements that contradict earlier rhetoric. In contrast, the war in Ukraine involves a major power confrontation where the facts on the ground diverge sharply from Western narratives. Russian forces maintain decisive manpower and firepower advantages, with ratios of 3-to-1 along much of the front, rising to 6-to-1 or even 8 one-inch key cities figures acknowledged by Zelensky himself. Desertions have reached existential levels, with tens of thousands leaving frontline positions and projections for the year approaching 100,000. A devastating blow to a force of roughly 400,000. Russia's artillery advantage ranges from 5 to 10 times Ukraine's, while its arsenal of precision glide bombs and superior drone operations eliminate any Ukrainian technological edge. The EU decision to cease direct military aid and shift responsibility to Europe represents a fundamental reversal that Europe cannot financially sustain. Debates over seizing frozen Russian assets reveal European desperation, but political and legal fears make such moves uncertain. Meanwhile, Russia's military has undergone a profound transformation since 2022, learning, adapting, expanding, and evolving into a far more capable force. No individual European military could withstand it, and while a direct US-Russia war would be catastrophic, Russia has no ambition to conquer all of Europe or resurrect an empire. Its strategy is focused on grinding attritional advances to secure specific territorial objectives. Yet as Russia moves toward victory, American policymakers face a dilemma. Great powers rarely accept defeat gracefully. Instead, they seek to impose costs through sanctions, proxy operations, and diplomatic isolation, ensuring long-term hostility rather than true peace. Finally, China's rise underscores structural tensions in the international system. The optimism of the 1,990 seconds that economic engagement would pacify China ignored the reality that nations operate in an anarchic world without a higher authority to guarantee security. China's drive for power reflects not ideology, but historical trauma. A century of exploitation by foreign empires created a deep commitment to never again be weak, just as the U.S. defends dominance in the Western Hemisphere under the Monroe Doctrine. China seeks regional dominance in East Asia, a symmetrical logic Washington finds unacceptable. Both great powers possess nuclear weapons, and flashpoints such as Taiwan or the South China Sea risk catastrophic escalation unless policymakers recognize the rational security interests of both sides. In an international system that rewards strength and punishes weakness, the U.S. seeks to prevent Chinese hegemony while China seeks it for its own security. This rivalry shapes not only regional stability, but the future of global order itself. Understanding these structural drivers is essential to preventing miscalculation and avoiding a great power conflict whose consequences would surpass any regional war.